Hey everyone, tonight we're diving straight into the Middle Ages' worst creations, the rogues, killers, and absolute catastrophes who somehow blundered their way into history books. Before you settle in, go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this kind of historical chaos. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing who's joining the madness from around the world. Now, lower the lights, let that background hum of a fan set the mood, and let's wander into the dark, damp mess of medieval mayhem together. If you've ever thought your career path was a disaster, meet Eustace the monk, a man who began as a Benedictine monk and ended up a pirate so unbearable that both England and France took turns trying to get rid of him. Born around 1170 in northern France, Eustace started out chasing holiness, maybe hoping for peace, humility, and divine purpose, all those noble ideas that sound wonderful until you actually try living them. After a few years of fasting, praying, and being bored out of his mind, he realized he preferred the sound of crackling fire to church bells. So he ditched the monastery, robbed travelers, torched houses, and announced that God himself had sent him on an adventure. Whether heaven actually co-signed that plan is debatable. Soon after, Eustace picked a feud with a nobleman named Renaud de Martine, a disagreement that escalated from insults to arson faster than a priest can say, "Forgive us our sins." When he lost his estate, he took to the seas, because if you can't win on land, why not start stealing other people's ships? He quickly earned a reputation as the most unpredictable man in the English Channel. One year he was raiding France for King John of England. The next, he was plundering English ports for the French. In short, he was a medieval one-man international crisis. Chroniclers claimed he could vanish into thin air, which probably just meant he was excellent at hiding in fog. He also bragged about dabbling in dark magic, which, in medieval terms, usually meant good at lying with confidence. Some even said he could summon storms and control the wind, though more likely he just waited for bad weather and took credit when it showed up. In 1217, Eustace's luck finally sank at the Battle of Sandwich when the English caught him aboard his ship. He tried to buy his freedom, adorable, considering how much he'd already looted. The English politely declined and decapitated him instead. They stuck his head on a mast, which in the 13th century counted as both justice and creative decor. To the French, he was a rebellious hero. To the English, a cursed pest. And to everyone else, solid proof that leaving the monastery doesn't always mean enlightenment. Sometimes it just means you about to start a crime spree. Now, moving to 14th century Ireland, where fame was scarce, but Alice Keitler somehow became rich, infamous, and accused of witchcraft, all before her fourth husband mysteriously dropped dead. Some people leave behind a legacy of good deeds. Alice left behind suspicious corpses and scandal. She was born wealthy, married even wealthier, and quickly discovered that being a smart woman in medieval society was suspicious enough. When all four of her husbands died under what polite people called odd circumstances, suspicion turned into full-blown panic. Kilkenny's townsfolk decided she was either the unluckiest bride in Europe or a witch with great aim. According to the official charges, Alice had a demon servant named Robin Ardison, who sometimes appeared as a black dog or shadowy figure, or maybe that was just an excuse invented by her enemies. She was accused of poisoning her husbands with potions, powders and strange herbs, which sounds like witchcraft, but also like medieval medicine. Witnesses claimed she sacrificed animals, muttered Latin backwards, and held secret gatherings with her followers. Basically, she did what most people in Kilkenny did on weekends, just with better publicity. The local bishop, Richard de Ledred, decided to turn her case into a moral crusade, because nothing says holy devotion like an old man fixated on a rich woman's business. Alice, being smarter than the mob, escaped to England before anyone could light a match. Unfortunately, her maid Petronilla de Meath wasn't as fortunate. She was tortured, flogged, and burned alive, becoming Ireland's first recorded witch execution, and a tragic reminder that medieval justice had limits, especially for women. Alice disappeared completely after that. Some said she lived quietly in England. Others believed she fled to Flanders. One rumor even claimed she remarried, which, if true, proves she had either unstoppable confidence or a serious habit. Whether she was guilty or not hardly matters. In an age when wealth, wit, and independence were crimes, surviving too well was the ultimate sin. Alice Keitler's magic wasn't sorcery. It was outsmarting a system built to destroy her. And that, in the Middle Ages, was nothing short of supernatural. Now, if you ever need proof that medieval nobility was just money mixed with madness, look no further than Gilla de Race, France's richest war hero turned full-time horror story. Born in 1405, Gilla had everything the era adored: noble blood, legendary bravery, and an estate large enough to need its own map. He fought beside Joan of Arc, the teenage saint who terrified the English and inspired a nation. Gilles was her loyal ally, brave, devout, and probably one of the only men in 15th century France who bathed without being forced. But when Joan was executed, something inside him shattered. Maybe grief, maybe guilt, maybe sheer lunacy. He retired from war, built a private theater, and started writing bizarre plays starring angels, demons, and himself as every lead character. From there, his life plunged straight into darkness. He surrounded himself with alchemists, sorcerers, and fortune-tellers who promised him endless riches as long as he provided a few special materials. Sadly, those materials tended to be human. Rumors spread of children disappearing from nearby villages. Witnesses told stories of strange rituals, flickering candles, and Gil losing his temper whenever his magical gold refused to appear. It was like a medieval crypto scheme, only bloodier. When the church finally stepped in, Gil was arrested and interrogated. An interrogation in the 15th century meant more hot iron than honest questioning. Under torture, he confessed to everything: murder, sorcery, and very poor judgment. Historians still argue over what was true and what was forced from him, but his reputation was ruined beyond repair. In 1440, Gilla de Race was hanged, burned, and reluctantly absolved. Some called him France's first serial killer. Others, a scapegoat for the corruption of the elite. Either way, going from saintly war hero to church excommunicated murderer takes effort. His castles decayed, his name was erased, but his legend endured. A man who began as a hero, ended as a monster, and still managed to make the nobility look even worse. And long before Robin Hood was teaching questionable economics to the poor, there was Hereward the Wake, England's original outlaw hero, the man who showed everyone how rebellion could become folklore. Unlike Robin Hood, Hereward the Wake wasn't charming, generous, or particularly nice. He was mostly just furious, and honestly, who could blame him? Born around 1035, Hereward was a proud Saxon noble who didn't take kindly to William the Conqueror's new management approach to England. When the Normans invaded in 1066, most Saxons shaved their heads, learned French words they hated, and tried to survive. But Hereward, he took one look at the new overlords, one look at his stolen land, and decided diplomacy was overrated. He gathered a band of exiles, outlaws, and angry farmers, then declared open season on anyone with a French accent. From the swampy wilderness of Ely, he launched lightning raids on Norman troops, torched settlements, ambushed knights, and occasionally liberated monasteries, which was medieval code for robbing them blind while calling it holy redistribution. His nickname, the Wake, might have meant the watchful one, though it could just as easily describe the trail of wreckage he left behind. Chroniclers couldn't decide whether he was a freedom fighter or a lunatic, and both descriptions worked. Hereward's greatest hit came when the Normans tried to reach Ely by building wooden roads across the bog. He waited until they were halfway across, then set everything ablaze. Picture a line of armored knights slowly sinking into a flaming swamp, part tragedy, part slapstick, 100% medieval spectacle. For a time, Hereward was unstoppable, the mud-soaked embodiment of Saxon rage. But rebellions, like medieval plumbing, never lasts long. The Normans eventually bribed his allies, overwhelmed his stronghold, and forced him into exile. Accounts disagree on how his story ended. Some say bounty hunters killed him. Others insist he lived quietly, always plotting one last strike that never came. Either way, his legend survived. To the English, he became a symbol of resistance, the man who refused to kneel. To the Normans, he was the boogeyman parents used to scare their children. And to history, he remains proof that being the last honest Saxon was an honorable title, right up until someone invented gunpowder. Scotland has given the world many great things: whiskey, bagpipes, and weather so depressing it could drive sunshine to therapy. But sometime in the damp 15th century, it allegedly produced Sawney Bean, a man so monstrous that even medieval writers added disclaimers like, "We really hope this story isn't true." The tale goes that Sawney left home after deciding that honest work was beneath him, a view shared by most aristocrats of his day. He and his equally deranged wife settled in a seaside cave near Galloway, chosen for its privacy and complete lack of witnesses. There, the two founded what can only be called the worst family business in history: robbery and cannibalism. Over time, they supposedly produced a sprawling clan of children and grandchildren, 48 in total, who all shared two things: a taste for human flesh and a dislike of sunlight. The Beans would ambush travelers along lonely roads, rob them, and drag the bodies back to their cave for storage. Imagine a medieval Costco, but every aisle smells like death. For decades, the family lived unseen, dining on the occasional tourist and decorating their cavern with what polite historians later referred to as remains. Eventually, when too many travelers vanished, suspicion grew. Locals blamed witches, monsters, and foreigners, the medieval holy trinity of scapegoats, until one victim escaped and led soldiers straight to the Bean clan's seaside slaughterhouse. What they found inside was worse than rumor: barrels of salted human meat, piles of bones, and enough body parts to fill a small museum. The Beans were captured and hauled to Edinburgh, where King James himself supposedly ordered immediate execution. No trial, no mercy, just old-fashioned efficiency. The men were hacked apart alive, and the women and children followed soon after. Brutal, horrific, and very on brand for the 15th century. Modern historians suspect the story is exaggerated or even completely fictional. Medieval Scotland was exactly famous for fact-checking. Still, the legend of Sonny Bean endures, because nothing grips the imagination quite like a family that chose cannibalism over a day job. Whether he existed or not, he remains a chilling reminder that sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding in castles. They re-squatting rent-free in a cave by the sea. If you thought the Middle Ages were chaotic enough, imagine adding organized crime to the mix. Not the slick, cigar-smoking kind, but one run by people who smelled like turnips and used stolen farm tools as weapons. Welcome to the Thieves Guild, the medieval version of a corporate network for people who preferred pickpocketing to honest work. In most medieval cities, crime wasn't just tolerated, it was practically a career path. You could be a blacksmith, a tanner, or, if you had quick hands and zero morals, a thief. Like the craftsmen's guilds, these underworld organizations had apprenticeships, codes of conduct, and training, all the essentials for a successful life of crime. In London, Paris, and Venice, thieves taught their craft like family recipes: a dash of stealth, a little distraction, and a quick escape through the nearest sewer. Initiation rituals were common. New recruits swore loyalty, learned secret gestures, and practiced cutting purses from dummies before graduating to real victims. In Paris, they were called coquillards. In England, they thrived in the grimy backstreets of Southwark, the kind of place where even rats locked their doors. Authorities knew they existed, of course, but medieval law enforcement was laughably unreliable. Constables were unpaid, corrupt, or simply asleep, and prisons were so filthy that being arrested in winter was considered free lodging with heat. Sometimes, city officials even made deals with the thieves. A little tax here, a little silence there. Yes, medieval protection rackets were real. But don't mistake it for some glamorous underworld. The Thieves' Guild was ruthless. Members who broke rules often lost a hand, ironic, considering that was their main tool of trade. Traitors simply vanished, usually along with their belongings. Still, they thrived. In a world obsessed with hierarchy, these guilds gave criminals a strange kind of dignity. Theft became an art, and survival a profession. So, if you ever time travel to the Middle Ages, remember 2 rules. Keep one hand on your coin purse. And if someone bumps into you twice, congratulations, you've just joined the local economy. The 18th century was a weird transitional era, not quite medieval, but still filthy enough to count spiritually. And in this grimy, halfway world rode Dick Turpin, England's most famous highwayman, a man whose legend sprinted far faster than his actual horse. Born around 1705 to a butcher's family, Turpin could have lived a decent life selling meat. Instead, he preferred to steal it. He started with cattle rustling, graduated to horse theft, and finally realized that robbing people directly was faster and came with better stories. Thus began his career as a highwayman, basically a glorified mugger with a sense of style. The roads around London were crawling with robbers, each convinced they were the next big thing in organized crime. But Turpin understood branding. He dressed sharply, spoke politely, and had a flair for performance. Victims described him as surprisingly courteous, which, compared to tax collectors, made him practically a saint. Soon, pamphlets and plays romanticized him as a gallant rogue, especially after tales spread of him riding his horse, Black Bess from London to York in one night, a 200-mile miracle that never actually happened. In truth, Turpin couldn't ride that far without stopping for a pint, a robbery, and probably another pint. Behind the myth, the real Turpin was violent, arrogant, and unreliable. After one botched robbery, he shot a man who recognized him and fled north under the alias John Palmer. It might have worked if he hadn't immediately started stealing horses again. His downfall came when he mailed a letter home and forgot to pay postage. The postmaster recognized his handwriting, and the rest was history. Turpin was arrested, tried, and hanged in 1739 before a cheering crowd. Ever the showman, he bowed to the audience before the trapdoor opened, the final performance of England's most theatrical criminal. His legend lives on, polished by centuries of exaggerated tales and bad history. In truth, he wasn't a gentleman bandit, just a thief who looked good in print. If the phrase holy warrior sounds like a contradiction, meet Fra Moriali, the monk who turned salvation into a side hustle and warfare into a business model. Born around 1310 in Provence, his real name was Montreal di Albarno, and he joined the Knights Hospitaller, a religious order devoted to healing pilgrims, protecting the faithful, and, when necessary, stabbing heretics. He swore vows of poverty and chastity, and broke both with remarkable enthusiasm. Fra Moriali had vowed poverty, chastity, and obedience, and then, like many ambitious monks, decided all three were optional extras. After a few years of pretending holiness paid the bills, he realized the real money was on the battlefield. So he swapped his rosary for a sword and rebranded himself as a condottiero, an Italian mercenary commander, because nothing says man of God like selling your loyalty to the highest bidder. 14th century Italy was a perpetual food fight of city-states, dukes, and popes, each trying to prove their banners were prettier. Moriali fit right in. He founded the Great Company, a massive army for hire so large it could conquer small nations on a slow weekend. They fought for whoever paid the best, and when no one did, they simply fought anyway. Villages were burned, towns ransomed, and neutrality was treated as a temporary medical condition. At one point, they even sacked the Papal States, which did nothing to improve his standing with heaven. Moriali grew obscenely rich, castles, gold, and according to one chronicler, a bed grand enough for a cardinal and morals to match. His soldiers respected him, peasants dreaded him, and nobles grudgingly admitted his invoices were always accurate. But like every man who mistakes greed for divine blessing, he pushed too far. By 1354, Moriali had managed to offend just about everyone, including the Pope. He was captured in Rome and executed by order of the Senate, who, in a rare moment of efficiency, killed him before he could bribe them. His corpse was tossed into the street, where locals celebrated by robbing the body. Irony. Medieval edition. Fra Moriali's tale proves that you can take a man out of the monastery, but you can't take the moral bankruptcy out of the monk. He died exactly as he lived, loudly, lucratively, and just a few commandments short of salvation. 15th century France, long before spies or the mafia, had its own criminal elite, a shadowy network called the Coquillards, a kind of medieval masterclass in organized deception. They operated mostly in Dijon, Burgundy, a city where half the population was drunk. The other half was scheming, and everyone was related. The Coquillards weren't pickpockets. They were professionals, forgers, scammers, and impersonators so slick they could rob you while quoting scripture. Their name came from coquille shell, after the scallop shell worn by pilgrims. disguised as holy travelers returning from Santiago de Compostela. They'd spin pious stories while quietly robbing their hosts blind. Think of them as medieval influencers, all performance, no substance. They spoke a private slang called argot, a coded language full of jokes, symbols, and insults. It wasn't just street talk, it was an entire criminal dialect. A purse was a fish, a knife a light, and an arrest was a left-handed blessing. The point was simple: confuse everyone but your accomplices. Even court documents from their trials read like riddles written by poets who run out of morals and sobriety. Fraud was their favorite sport. They sold fake relics, a thriving business in a nation obsessed with saintly toenails, forged letters and seals, and ran distraction scams in crowded markets. On lazy days, they faked royal decrees because nothing said easy profit like imitating a king's handwriting. Their downfall came when Burgundy's rulers realized that the entire city had been outwitted by men in borrowed monk robes. The Duke ordered mass arrests. The trials were bizarrely theatrical. Some thieves defended themselves in perfect Latin, which was somehow more shocking than the crimes. A few were executed, others vanished, and the rest simply changed the guild's name and went back to work. Officially erased, the Coquillards never truly died. They just evolved into every con, Ponzi scheme, and get-rich-with outworking scam that followed. In their own twisted way, they were innovators, not of virtue, but of the timeless human dream, money without effort. While the Mediterranean had its romantic pirates with earrings and poetry, the Baltic Sea got something colder, meaner, and far smellier: the Hanseatic pirates, better known as the Vital Inbrooder, or less poetically, the Victual Brothers. Yes, they were literally named after food. Nothing terrifies sailors like being boarded by men called the Snack Squad. The Victual Brothers actually started with good intentions, which, historically, is the first sign of disaster. In the late 1300s, the Duke of Mecklenburg hired them to deliver supplies to Stockholm, which was under siege by the Danes. They did the job, got paid, and then realized that crime was much more fun than employment. So they stopped delivering food and started stealing ships instead. Before long, they were raiding merchants, kidnapping sailors, and ransoming entire towns. The Hanseatic League, a network of powerful trading cities that basically ran northern Europe like a corporate monopoly, tried to stop them, but the pirates were too efficient. Their motto: God's friends and the world's enemies. Honestly, it would make an amazing Twitter bio. They didn't just rob ships, they disrupted entire economies. Grain prices soared, trade collapsed, and desperate cities began paying them protection money. Imagine being extorted by men who smelled like herring. Their base was Gotland Island, which they turned into a pirate republic, complete with taverns, black markets, and the worst seafood in history. By the early 1400s, they were less a gang and more a floating anarchy, raiding by day, selling stolen goods to bishops by night. Even the Teutonic Knights tried to fight them, but holy knights in heavy armor didn't stand much chance against drunken sailors with axes. Eventually, the Hanseatic League united its fleets and wiped them out in a series of brutal sea battles. The captured pirates were publicly executed, not out of moral outrage, but because merchants were sick of filing insurance claims. Still, their legend lived on. The Vital Inbrooder were vicious, brilliant, and occasionally patriotic, depending on who was paying. Their story proved a timeless truth. If you feed pirates long enough, eventually they'll stop serving you dinner and start serving you as dinner. If medieval Germany had Netflix, Peter Nears would have had his own true crime series, probably called Witchcraft, Murder, and Terrible Life Choices. Born in the 16th century, Nears was a wandering outlaw who turned career crime into something closer to supernatural horror. He began small, a little theft, a few muggings, the odd stabbing, but competition was fierce. So, like any overachiever, he found a niche: satanic serial murder. According to lurid pamphlets of the time, he killed over 500 people, including pregnant women whose unborn children he supposedly used for rituals. The number alone is absurd. He would needed a payroll department, but the fear was very real. Locals claimed he carried a bag of occult trinkets, candles made of human fat, stolen hearts, and probably some unfortunate snacks. Rumor also said he could shapeshift into animals to escape, which sounds ridiculous until you remember that medieval Europe thought frogs were agents of the devil. Both church and state hunted him relentlessly, but Nears was slippery. He bribed innkeepers, beggars, and fellow criminals to hide him. To peasants, he was both horrifying and awe-inspiring, a man who broke every law, human and divine, and somehow kept breathing. But, like most plumbing in the Middle Ages, crime never ended cleanly. In 1577, he was captured once and escaped, prompting officials to execute his accomplices twice out of embarrassment. He vanished for years before resurfacing near Newmarket, where an innkeeper grew suspicious of his grotesque bag. Within hours, Europe's most wanted man was dragged from his dinner and arrested. His death was designed for maximum spectacle: 2 days of torture, the breaking wheel, and eventual dismemberment. It was medieval closure at its most thorough. Peter Nears' story reminds us that every era has its monsters, but few were as organized, theatrical, or disturbingly creative about it as him. The crowd supposedly erupted in applause, half for justice, half because, in 1581, public executions were the closest thing to prime-time entertainment. Whether Peter was an actual sorcerer or just an especially unhinged psychopath, he left behind medieval Europe's most cursed. Resume a man so vile it took 2 religions and a full toolkit of torture devices to make absolutely sure he stopped breathing. Every now and then, the Middle Ages spat out someone who glanced at the muck, hunger, and taxes and thought, actually, no thanks. One of those rare souls was Robert of Ridsdale, an English rebel who proved that when life gives you feudalism, you can always set it ablaze. The year was 1469. England was halfway through the Wars of the Roses Bay, a long, bloody family feud about who got to wear the crown and ruin the economy next. While nobles carved each other up in shiny armor, the peasants were left penniless, starving, and one tax bill away from losing it completely. Enter Robert. Historians can't agree who he really was. Some call him a disgraced knight, others a rogue soldier, and one scribe simply described him as an angry man with influence, which could apply to most of England at the time. Whatever his background, Robert gathered thousands of farmers, villagers, and small landowners beneath his bannerknot with grand promises of liberty, but with something more relatable: payback against the people who made bread unaffordable. The rebellion of Ridsdale spread across northern England like a rumor in a tavern. Castles were raided, manors burned, and officials were dragged out of their homes for the medieval version of a performance review. Robert's army thundered south, shouting slogans about reform, though it's likely most of them were just hungry and wanted to see London before dying. At first, it worked. Local nobles panicked, and the royal court started sweating. But as usual, reality showed up wearing armor. A proper royal army appeared, unimpressed by the enthusiasm of pitchfork-wielding peasants, and Robert's rebellion crumbled in days. Survivors swung from gallows, villages were fined, and history returned to being written by people who had servants. Robert himself vanished, executed, assassinated, or simply absorbed back into the mud he came from. His name lived on only as a warning. Never let peasants start thinking for themselves. Still, he made his point. Even in England's rigid, God-approved social pyramid, there was only so much a manor, a village, could take. Robert didn't win, but he reminded kings that pitchforks are just poor people's swords. Long before spies, mobsters, or Netflix anti-heroes, the world had the Assassins of Alamut, secret brotherhood, so infamous their name became shorthand for professional murder. Today, assassin means killer. Back then, it meant the person who makes kings check under their beds. Their story begins in 11th century Persia, where a brilliant and stubborn man named Hassan Seba decided the Muslim world needed more discipline, fewer heretics, and definitely fewer opinions that weren't his. He broke away from mainstream Islam, formed his own sect, and seized a mountain fortress called Alamut, Stone Eagle's Nest, high in northern Iran. From there, he built one of the most feared secret organizations in history. Enemies nicknamed them the Hashishin, claiming they used hashish before missions, a smear probably invented by someone bitter about being stabbed in public. In truth, they were anything but drugged fanatics, educated, calm, and terrifyingly precise. Their art was political murder, carried out so surgically that entire wars shifted after a single dagger strike. They infiltrated palaces disguised as servants, scribes, or even gardeners, waiting patiently until the perfect moment to kill swiftly, silently, and preferably in front of witnesses to drive the message home. Rulers across the Middle East slept badly. Kings, caliphs, and crusader lords inspected their food, wine, and bedrooms twice nightly. Some even locked themselves in towers ringed with moats until a bribed guard opened the door. The assassins never needed armies. Fear did the heavy lifting. A single well-placed murder could stop invasions, rewrite treaties, or convince an emperor to suddenly find humility. Even Saladin, the legendary conqueror of Jerusalem, barely escaped their hit list twice. Eventually, the Mongols rolled in during the 13th century and flattened Alamut, because nothing survives a Mongol invasion's cities, fortresses, or secret cults. Yet the legend endured. Assassin became a permanent entry in every language. Proof that sometimes the sharpest political argument is a very small, very well-aimed knife. If you lived in medieval London and still had money by sundown, congratulations, you'd just survived the city's favorite sport, not getting robbed. Long before bankers perfected corporate theft, there were the cut-purse, nimble-fingered professionals who turned pickpocketing into performance art. London in the Middle Ages was a chaotic stew of markets, pilgrims, drunks, and goats, ideal conditions for petty crime. While preachers warned about greed, the cut-purses quietly tested their sermon's sincerity by stealing the collection plate. They weren't brutes or muggers, they were artists. The blade had to be razor-sharp, the hand steady, the movement invisible. Their name was literal. They sliced the strings of a coin pouch and disappeared into the crowd before you noticed the breeze on your hip. Some worked solo, others in pairs. One distracted the victim, a bump, a sorry, good sir, or a sudden religious lecture, while the other did the cutting. By the time you said amen, your week's wages had joined the heavenly choir. Thievery was a craft. Apprentices trained under masters, often practicing on drunks or scarecrows until they could snip a purse mid-handshake. Success demanded grace under pressure and absolutely zero moral compass. Justice, naturally, was brutal. Thieves were hanged so often that executions turned into networking events. When your mentor was dangling from a rope, you inherited his clients. And it wasn't just men-female cutpurses thrived too, often posing as flower sellers or humble washerwomen. One legendary thief, Non-Hackett, worked the aisles of churches during Mass, targeting noblewomen who closed their eyes too long in prayer. Authorities knew, of course, but most were on the payroll. Sheriffs, judges, even guards took their cut, sometimes literally. For every thief swinging from the gallows, 3 more were working the crowd below. Over time, cutpurse became an insult for anyone morally flexible, from crooks to politicians. And honestly, not much has changed. Modern London may have fewer pouches and more passwords, but the spirit of the cutpurse lives on, usually behind a customer service desk or in your bank's transaction fees. Say the name Vlad the Impaler, and people imagine vampires, bats, and gothic melodrama. The truth is simpler and nastier. Vlad didn't drink blood, he just spilled it by the gallon with a bureaucrat's precision. Born in 1431 in Transylvania, Vlad of Wallachia ruled a small patch of land wedged between 2 empires, Ottoman and Hungarian, both of which treated his country less like a kingdom and more like a chew toy. His father, Vlad Dracul, was part of the Order of the Dragon, a knightly club that sounded noble but mostly attracted men who liked crosses, swords, and holding grudges. Vlad Jr., nicknamed Dracula, son of the dragon, took the branding seriously. As a youth, he was held hostage by the Ottomans, where he learned statecraft, warfare, and a lifelong hatred of everyone. When he finally reclaimed his throne in 1456, Vlad set out to fix his nation's crime problem with overkill. His favorite punishment, impalement, involved driving a wooden stake through the body and letting gravity finish the paperwork. Thieves, liars, diplomats, and dinner guests who annoyed him all qualified. Foreign ambassadors who refused to remove their hats were nailed to their own heads, an efficient way to settle etiquette debates. When the Ottomans invaded, Vlad lined 20,000 prisoners on stakes outside the capital. The sight was so horrific, the invaders simply turned around. Can't really blame them. To his people, he was both savior and nightmare. Crime plummeted partly from fear, partly because half the criminals were now lawn ornaments. Merchants could leave gold in the streets and find it untouched in the morning, assuming they didn't mind the smell. Eventually, Vlad was captured by the Hungarians, released, and finally killed in battle. His severed head was sent to the Sultan in a jar of honeyproof that even mass murderers cared about presentation. The palace at Babylon was restless that night. The air itself seemed heavy, thick with incense, whispers, and the weight of a king's fading breath. Servants moved like shadows, silent but trembling, carrying wine, water, and bowls of oil to the bed where the conqueror of the world lay motionless. Alexander, son of Philip, lord of Macedon, pharaoh of Egypt, king of Persia, and master of Asia, now battled something he could not see, could not command, could not defeat. Fever burned through him like wildfire, and even the greatest physicians of the empire stood helpless. For 12 years, he had conquered everything the horizon could show him. He had crossed deserts, climbed mountains, shattered armies, and built cities in his name. But here, in the summer of 323 BCE, at only 32 years old, the man who called himself the son of Zeus was reduced to a whisper between worlds. Babylon's walls, which had seen empires rise and fall, now watched the most legendary of them all fade into silence. His general's men who had marched with him from Macedon to India stood in uneasy silence. Ptolemy, Perdiccas, Seleucus, Antipaterich watched, not just their king, but their future slipping away. Outside, the streets of Babylon pulsed with tension. Soldiers prayed to gods they barely believed in. Some whispered that Alexander had been poisoned. Others said it was divine punishment. And some, the ones who had seen him drink from rivers no man should drink from, said the earth itself had finally taken revenge for the wounds he had given it. Alexander's fever had begun days earlier after a night of drinking and celebration. He had been planning his next conquest, Arabia, the last corner of the world he had yet to claim. His commanders had begged him to rest, but Alexander never rested. He believed sleep was a luxury for those without purpose. So when the pain began, he ignored it. He rode, commanded, feasted, laughed. But each morning, his voice grew weaker. His hands began to shake. Soon he could no longer rise from his bed. The wine he once devoured by the amphora turned to fire in his throat. His body trembled uncontrollably, and his eyes burned with fever. And still, he refused to stop issuing orders. Even from his bed, Alexander demanded reports from his generals. Maps were brought to his chamber, unrolled before him. His hand, once steady as a sword, could barely hold a pen, but he traced his finger across the parchment, outlining the coasts he would never see. The city of Babylon, outside his window, shimmered in the heat. Birds circled the river. Life continued, unaware that a world was ending. Because that is what Alexander had become, not a man, but a world unto himself. His empire stretched from Greece to India, across deserts, mountains, and seas. He had built it with speed and fire, and now, as he lay dying, it was as fragile as his heartbeat. The priests came, offering sacrifices. They burned bulls and sheep, poured wine upon the earth, and chanted to every god they knew, Greek, Persian, Egyptian, but nothing changed. Alexander's skin turned pale, his breath short and uneven. Rumors spread like smoke. Some said he had been poisoned at a banquet. Others whispered that the gods had turned against him for claiming divinity. A few even said Aristotle, his old teacher, had plotted his death from afar. But those who knew him best saw no murder, only exhaustion. The weight of the world had crushed its bearer. By the 9th day of his illness, Alexander could no longer speak. His generals lined up at his bedside, each desperate to hear one final command, one name, one clue about who would rule after him. But Alexander, eyes half open, could only nod faintly. The great voice that had commanded nations was gone. Instead, he gestured for his ring, the signet of kingship. His hand trembled as he passed it to Perdiccas, one of his closest officers. It was not a coronation, but a trust. Around him, the air crackled with unspoken ambition. Every man in that room saw himself as the rightful heir. Every heartbeat of their dying king was a countdown to chaos. Outside Babylon's streets, filled with soldiers waiting for news, the Macedonian army, restless and afraid, demanded to see their commander. Word spread that Alexander was dead, then that he was alive, then that he had risen again. Truth became another rumor. Inside, the light dimmed. His mother, Olympias, far away in Macedon, had always said her son was born not of Philip but of Zeus himself, and that lightning had fathered him. But now, as his breath grew faint, there was no thunder, only silence. Alexander's fever surged again. His eyes rolled back, and for a moment he seemed to drift somewhere beyond the room. Some said they saw him smile faintly, as if seeing something no one else could. Perhaps he saw Hephaestion, his lost friend, waiting for him. Perhaps he saw the endless plains he never reached. Perhaps he saw nothing at all. The priests called for more offerings. The smell of burning flesh filled the palace. Outside, the sun began to set over Babylon's walls, casting long shadows over the river Euphrates. The empire stretched endlessly beyond those walls, and yet, in that single room, its heart was failing. On the 10th day, Alexander could barely move. His generals took turns sitting by his bed, whispering questions, desperate for a word. But when one of them asked, "To whom do you leave your empire?" Alexander's lips barely moved. "Some say," he answered, "to the strongest. Others claim," he said, "it will be enough." Both answers fit him perfectly. The strongest because his life had been a contest of will and power. It will be enough because he knew the world he had built was too vast, too alive, to belong to one man alone. As the final night approached, Babylon grew unnaturally quiet. Even the soldiers in the courtyard stopped speaking. A storm gathered in the distance. The air grew thick and heavy. In his room, Alexander's chest rose and fell, each breath a battle. His hand, once steady enough to guide thousands across continents, now trembled like a leaf. Ptolemy leaned close, whispering a prayer. Others wept. For the first time, men who had seen death in every form now feared it in one. Alexander's eyes opened once more. He looked at his generals, his friends, his empire in miniature, standing before him. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper came. The attendants leaned closer. "When I am gone," he rasped, "bury me with my hands outside the coffin, so the world will see that even a king leaves empty-handed." Then he smiled faintly, a smile that still carried command, "and tell them I lived." The fever took him again. His body grew still. Outside, the storm broke, lightning flashing over the walls of Babylon, as if the heavens themselves were saluting their fallen son. In the corridors, soldiers dropped to their knees. The conqueror of the world had taken his final kingdom, but death, like conquest, brought no peace. Within hours, the struggle began. The generals who had sworn loyalty to him now turned their eyes on each other. The question that burned through Babylon was the same one whispered at his bedside: who would rule now? But for that one night, the city stood silent. The torches burned low. The body of Alexander the Great lay upon his bed, wrapped in linen and silence. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, echoing over the empire he had carved with sword and fire. And perhaps, just for a moment, the world held its breath, uncertain whether it had lost a man. The world after Alexander's death felt hollow, as if the sun had dimmed and no one could remember how to bring it back. Babylon, once the heartbeat of his empire, turned into a tomb of whispers. The great conqueror's body lay in silence, but his name still commanded storms. His generalsmen, who had followed him across deserts and through rivers of blood, now looked at each other, not as brothers, but as rivals. The unity that had carried them through 12 years of conquest dissolved in days. There was no chosen heir. His infant son was far too young, and his empire far too vast. The question no one dared answer, while he breathed, now demanded blood. Who would wear the crown of the world? Perdiccas, who had received the royal signet, tried to act as regent, claiming to protect Alexander's legacy. But in truth, every man around him imagined himself as the next Alexander. Ptolemy dreamed of Egypt, Seleucus of Persia, Antipater of Macedon, and Cassander of power itself. Babylon became a chessboard, and Alexander's corpse, the king that every piece wanted to claim. The soldiers, still loyal to the memory of their leader, gathered outside the palace, demanding to see him one last time. So the doors were opened, and the body of Alexander was carried out, dressed in royal armor, face calm and unyielding. His skin had not yet faded. He looked, they said, almost alive. Some fell to their knees. Others reached out, desperate to touch even the air near him. For many, it was not grief that filled them, but disbelief. How could someone who had walked through fire and returned now be gone forever? Yet, as they wept, the real war began not for land, but for possession of his remains. In ancient times, the body of a ruler was more than flesh. It was a symbol, a key to legitimacy. Whoever buried Alexander could claim his spirit, his empire, his myth. Perdiccas ordered that the body be sent to Macedon to rest beside his father Philip, but Ptolemy had other plans. Egypt had been one of Alexander's proudest conquests, and Alexandria, the city that bore his name, was his greatest creation. Ptolemy knew that if he could bring the body there, Egypt would become the heart of Alexander's legend. So, as the funeral procession began its long journey west, Ptolemy acted. The cortege, guarded by thousands of soldiers, moved slowly across the sands, carrying a golden sarcophagus encrusted with jewels. The cart itself was said to be a masterpiece, adorned with statues of gods, lions, and angels. It glittered like a moving temple. People along the route knelt as it passed, as if the conqueror were still alive, merely sleeping. But when the procession reached Syria, Ptolemy struck. With a carefully planned ambush, he seized the body and diverted it south toward Egypt. Perdiccas raged when he heard the news, swearing vengeance, declaring Ptolemy a thief of gods. Armies began to march. The first war of the successors had begun, and Alexander's body, cold, silent, divine, was its cause. Ptolemy carried the body to Memphis, and later to Alexandria, where he built a magnificent tomb known as the Soma. There Alexander's body was laid in a crystal coffin, visible to all who came to pay tribute. Pilgrims, kings, and conquerors from across the ancient world traveled to see him. Caesar himself, 3 centuries later, would bow before that glass coffin and weep. The man who had dreamed of being a new Alexander knelt before the original, as if to admit that no one would ever match him. But back in the years after his death, his empire burned. The men he had trusted most became wolves. Perdiccas, trying to hold the empire together, was murdered by his own officers. Antigonus seized Asia Minor. Lysimachus took Thrace. Seleucus claimed Babylon and beyond. And Ptolemy ruled Egypt as if it had always been his. The unity Alexander had forged with blood was undone by greed. His dream of a single world under one king vanished, replaced by maps drawn in war and inked in betrayal. And yet, even as the world he built crumbled, the legend of Alexander grew. Stories spread faster than armies. Some said his body never decayed, that even death refused to touch him. Others claimed he had never truly died at all, that he had ascended to Olympus to dine among the gods. Poets wrote of his journeys to the edge of the earth, of rivers of gold and trees that spoke his name. In every corner of the empire, men told tales of the boy who had tamed Bucephalus, the horse no one else could ride, and the king who had crossed the impossible. His name became a spell, a curse, and a dream all at once. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Ptolemy guarded the tomb as fiercely as he would a fortress. He knew that as long as Alexander's body lay within his land, Egypt would never bow to another power. The tomb itself became the center of the Hellenistic world, a place where Greeks, Egyptians, and Persians alike could stand together in awe. It was said that Alexander's face, beneath the crystal, still looked serene, as though he were watching the living with faint amusement. But not everyone wanted the king to rest. Centuries passed, and the tomb became both shrine and secret. Some believed that each dynasty that ruled Alexandria touched his coffin, hoping to inherit his strength. Others whispered that touching it brought madness. Then one day, the tomb was lost, whether buried by an earthquake, stolen, or hidden by priests, no one knows. To this day, the resting place of Alexander the Great remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Yet the true legacy of Alexander was not the tomb, nor the empire, nor even the battles. It was the idea that a single human being could stretch the limits of what humanity believed possible. He was born in a small kingdom at the edge of Greece and died believing he had reached the ends of the earth. And in that belief, he changed everything. His conquests spread Greek culture across continents, blending East and West into something new, philosophy meeting mysticism, sculpture meeting scripture, science meeting stars. He built cities where there had been deserts, markets where there had been war. He made men from dozens of nations march together under one banner, even if that unity did not survive him. His death left a wound that the world has never quite healed. The men who fought to succeed him ruled kingdoms, but none ruled hearts. The name Alexander outlived them all. Even as centuries rolled by and empires rose and fell, his shadow stretched across them. Rome worshipped him. Persia remembered him. India still spoke of him. And yet, for all his glory, his end was quiet. His last wish, humbled to be shown to the world with empty hands, reminding all who followed that conquest ends where mortality begins. There is a strange irony to his story. He had once wept because there were no more worlds left to conquer, yet the one thing he could never master was the silence that came after. Perhaps that is what makes his story eternal, not his victories, but his humanity. For behind the armor and the legend was a young man who dreamed too big for his body to contain. The fever that ended him did not erase him, it immortalized him. Babylon became dust, his generals became footnotes, but his name turned into a compass by which ambition measures itself. Every empire since has carried a fragment of Alexander in its heartbeat. Somewhere, buried or lost, his body may still rest beneath sand or sea, but his story walks freely across centuries, unburied and unbroken. Maybe that is what he wanted all along, not immortality of flesh, but of memory. And so the boy from Macedon, who once stared at the horizon and saw destiny, became the horizon itself.